Tenemos un invitado de lujo que realmente es un honor poder tenerlo con nosotros acá. Les quiero pedir a quienes consideren que va a ser más provechoso poder escucharlo en español, que utilicen los dispositivos de traducción simultánea que van a tener. Hay un experto haciendo la traducción también, así que va a ser súper clarito. Vamos a dejar a Alexis para que lo presente con bombos y platillos, pero de verdad es un lujo poder tenerlo. Va a ser un extracto de lo que es su charla, especialmente adaptada para el evento de hoy. Así que Alexis, todas las presentaciones son tuyas.
Muchas gracias, Carola. Me trae la carpeta porque decir todos los títulos de Bob no los puedo memorizar. Hi, Bob. Nice to see you. So let me switch to English now. I'm going to introduce Bob Merton. Professor Merton is very kind to be with us today in this very important day for particularly our life. Well, thank you very much, Bob. So I'm going to introduce you. Professor Merton, I will try to be concise, although this is a very difficult task, because of the Bob's career. Professor Merton is a School of Management, distinguished professor of finance at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and is an emeritus professor at Harvard University since 2010. Merton received the Alfred Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1997 for a new method of determining the value of derivatives. He is past president of the American Finance Association, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Last year, he was named the recipient of MIT 2021-2022 James R. Killian Jr. Faculty Achievement Award, which is the highest honor the Institute faculty can confer upon one of its members. The Killian Award citation, hails Merton as one of the founding architects of modern finance theory, whose work has become an integral part of the global financial system. He is also a resident scientist at Dimensional Fund Advisors Incorporated. Merton received a BA in Engineering Mathematics from Columbia University, MS in Applied Mathematics from California Institute of Technology, and a PhD in Economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, together with numerous honorary degrees from US and foreign universities. On a personal note, I had the opportunity to work with Bob in 2 courses as his teaching assistant at MIT, and he was part of my dissertation committee. These were by far the greatest experience I have had in my life. I learned many new things in finance from one of the fathers of modern finance, but overall, I learned one of the most important lessons in my academic life: how it is possible to teach with passion and humility to our students. So before starting, I would like to thank you on behalf of Pharu Analytics today, Bob, and just to say that I really want to thank you for accepting my invitation to give this talk, despite the fact I know you have an extremely tight schedule. So, this is for all of us a one of a kind opportunity to hear you. Thank you very much. You can start now.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here on this special occasion for Pharu Analytics. My subject for tonight I chose, I'm going to put up some slides here for the screen, so just give me a second to, where are they? Oh, here. Give me for a second till I get ourselves. Okay. Well, as I say, I'm greatly pleased to be here on this occasion. My subject for tonight will be financial engineering. That's the taking of finance, science, and technology and applying it to solving real world problems that are many of them quite important. I think that's an appropriate topic given what Pharu Analytics is about. And I'm going to give you a history of the emergence of financial engineering and then take you up and then look a bit into the future. So if you're ready to go, let's get started. And let's start with finance as the science. Well, of course, finance has been around forever. But as a formal science, I find it, in my view, it really began about in 1952 with the work of Harry Markowitz. He's not the father of finance science, but he was at the beginning of it. And I have here a list of contributors to that science starting at that time for the next 20 years. And you'll recognize, I'm not going to go through each of them, but if you recognize any of the names, you'll notice that Markowitz, Arrow, Tobin, Miller, Modigliani, Fama, Samuelson, Sharp, and myself, and Black, as well, Scholes, all received Nobel Prizes in economics for their work in finance. So, on that alone, we might say that qualifies it as a science. But it would not be a science if it hadn't been for the fundamental work done back in the early 1960s, when for the first time there was a comprehensive collection of data, financial data going back to the 1920s, and they collected the returns on all stocks that traded in the United States and the New York Stock Exchange for that roughly 40-year period. This changed the financial world, and certainly you cannot have a science without data to test the hypotheses as well as helping you to formulate new hypotheses. And this is when it happened. So today, with the enormous amount of data available in finance and related fields, it's hard to believe. You can go on your telephone and get what's going on all around the world and so forth. But this is where it all began. And so by the end of the 1960s, finance had developed a very systematic and rich set of theories, hypotheses, tested them, and as I said, important data. And so it was a full science by that time. Now it's a young science because, inshallah, Markowitz, who I dated at the beginning, is still working. So it's a young science, but it's a science that has had an important impact in its life on economics, the economic system, growth and development. And I want to take you through how that sort of evolved. Now, as I mentioned, finance science was fully developed science, but had very little direct impact on finance practice. Sure, people used some of the stuff, but they really didn't. And that all changed, however, in the 1970s. There were a series of shocks, financial and economic shocks. In the beginning in the 1970s, just an explosion of risk. And I just listed some here for you, just to remind you that, the magnitude of those shocks. First, we had the fall of Bretton Woods in 1971. For the generation, for more than 30 years, currencies had all been fixed. Nobody had to think about currency changes or exchange rates very much because they were all fixed. Suddenly, at the beginning of the 70s, they began floating and all these currencies going everywhere, whether you were in trade or whether you're doing in finance and so forth. Suddenly, this was a risk that no one had to really address for a generation. The second one on here was the oil prices. The first one in the early 70s, where oil went from about $240 a barrel to about $13 a barrel. Enormous shock. Now, we didn't know we were going to have the number, but there was a second one before the end of the decade. So this, of course, was a major disruption. In the United States, double-digit inflation. Now, that was the highest in more than 50 years. We hadn't seen anything like that in the United States. There was practically no one alive or anyone working who had experienced it. And at its peak, it was as high as 12%. Now, and so in some parts of the world, that's not so impressive. And today, with inflation growing, it makes it a little less of a shock. But considering that, this was this enormous aberration. And of course, what came with high inflation is double-digit interest rates. Again, the highest in U.S. history. In the very early 1980s, we peaked in interest rates at 21% on U.S. full faith and credit treasuries. It's remarkable. Okay. At the same time, the stock market fell by 50% in an 18-month period, and there was no mortgage money for housing. Residential housing essentially couldn't be financed. Now, that was due to a regulation that did allow banks to pay more than 5% on their deposits. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a financier to understand that if you can get 10% or more from the government fully guaranteed with a tax break, okay, you're not going to be putting very much money in banks at 5%. And that's just completely crushed the residential housing market at the time. But with all this inflation, you also had high unemployment. In fact, unemployment hit 9% at its peak. This wasn't supposed to happen under the economics of the time. You either had high inflation or high unemployment, and there were actions you could take to reach. But when you have them both together, that created a problem that had not been seen before or addressed before, but a very difficult problem to do something about. Because whatever you did to try to bring inflation down, as many countries are doing, including mine, doing that, is just going to exasperate the unemployment. And, vice versa. If you do something to bring unemployment down, you're likely to do inflation. So this was I can't describe it. This was an amazing set of shocks where no one had had any experience. No one at least were in operation. And the idea of high unemployment and high inflation at the same time, we came to call it stagflation. And I don't think we really know even today, half century later, how to handle that. I hope it doesn't come back. But so I set the stage with all of these shocks. Now, what was the response to these shocks? There was an explosion of a wave of financial innovation. It started in the 70s with this kind of shocks, creating new risks that had to be dealt with. And really, it ran right through into the 80s at a very high intensity. And it's still continuing to this day. And many of the innovations, new markets, new institutions, new securities, etc., many of those have been adopted throughout the world subsequently, not under any stress conditions. But they came in response to these crises. It was at that time that financial engineering emerges, the use of finance science to solve real-world problems. And it was at that time that finance science and finance practice became inexorably linked. And when I say finance science, I mean the most advanced work going on in the science and the most developed databases were being used to address mainstream important financial practice. And that's where that came. And that's very special, even within economics, to see. Now, to show you some of what those innovations are, many of which you'll recognize because they're mainstream, have been for decades part of most or many financial systems in the world. But we created an options exchange, for example. Well, what are options? Options are basically insurance. It was a way to insure yourself against risks in whatever markets the options were on, equities or so. We created financial futures where we could manage the risks of currencies, interest rate risks, remember double-digit interest rates fluctuating, and of course stocks. We developed the first electronic stock market. The United States completely redid its corporate pension system, created pension funds. There were no pension funds prior to this period in corporations. They just didn't have them, something we take for granted today. The idea of so-called index passive investing, which again has trillions of dollars and is a very standard device for people who are investing as how to invest, was developed then and implemented. International institutions doing international diversification in stocks also. And then I mentioned, one of the shocks was residential housing just didn't have any financing. So there was a creation of a national mortgage funding market. Instead of having it in individual local banks being responsible for everything from gathering the funds needed to fund local things, you suddenly were able to have residential mortgages funded not only on a national basis, but indeed many outside the country invested in providing funding for residential mortgages. And that innovation and implementation of that market has been paying social dividends for the last 4 decades. We've had, of course, like all countries, fluctuations in mortgage rates. We've seen a big change in this past year in the United States, and we've had tighter, a little tighter. There's never been a time since we created that national mortgage market that there hasn't been money for residential mortgages. So those are social dividends just from that have been being paid long after the crisis is gone, long after the reason for motivating a solution. There's so many of these. I have a second slide for you, but the institutionalization of the stock market, that all began with the getting rid of the cartel on stock commissions, where institutions buying hundreds of thousands of shares paid the same commissions as you or I might buying 100 shares. And that set off with the modern way in which stock investing is done today and the institutional structure of that. Debt securitization, money market funds as a substitute for banks because banks couldn't pay more than 5%, and all kinds of debt financing for higher risk, high yield, floating rates, all kinds of innovation. And then I'll mention just one other, the idea of the interest rate swap, which is a simple derivative to understand. You swap a fixed rate of interest for a floating rate of interest. And that's all that's going on. But the introduction of that contract took the biggest risk out of well-run, high-quality banks, which was the disintermediation or the risk that when interest rates changed radically because of their intermediating process, banks would routinely find themselves actually insolvent. Governments would step in, but it was not just credit risk, it was interest rate risk in this period of time. And the interest rate swap forever eliminated that risk as something that banks had to take in order to facilitate both clients, borrowers who wanted floating rates to get their money whenever they wanted, and lenders and depositors, and lenders who, because of the changing interest rates and so forth and fluctuations, didn't want to take on that risk where they could go bankrupt on real estate projects and so forth by changing interest rates, and they wanted to have fixed. And so it solved two very important problems, but at the cost prior to the swap of putting banks into a very risky circumstance. That's forever gone. Every bank in the world, central banks, all of them use swaps to manage this risk. No bank has to take interest rate risk if it doesn't want to. Okay, so these are the kinds of innovations that all happen in this period, which is, again, to emphasize it, not only were big innovations in finance, but have caused the growth and development in the economies and allowed investments and so forth, and vastly reduced the cost of bearing risk and so forth. And we're seeing elements of that innovation going on, of course, now in the payment systems and so forth around the world. But what I wanted to end this little piece that introduced this is by mentioning that these innovations could not have been done without the finance science, both the quantitative models, breakthrough models, and databases that were needed and could be used to solve these problems as they came up, and to allow these markets to be created, and if they were created, to allow people to have means of trading in them and doing things efficiently and effectively. If you didn't have these, you couldn't do it. In fact, today, no financial institution, including central banks, can get by without both using these derivative markets, the options market, and so forth, and without using the models and databases for finance science. So it was at that time that the two came together, and we had the innovation, the introduction of financial engineering as a mainstream impact for innovation, for financial innovation. Now, I just want to mention that there was a bit of luck here, in the sense that all these came together at the right time. So, for example, I mentioned that the first options market was created in 1973. The so-called Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing model, which was developed entirely in theory, because there were no traded option markets at the prior to the creation of the CBOE, the options exchange, and so that model happened to be developed in the very late 60s. Really, the model had been worked out by 1970, 71, and it was published at the same time, actually. So at the very time that an option exchange, a trading exchange, we absolutely could not operate without having the right kinds of quantitative models and so forth in order to implement actual trading and pricing and so forth, just happened to be available when needed. So, as I mentioned here on the slide, that if you look at traders, the model gave exactly what traders needed in order to hedge their positions and do all the things they do to have a model. And within 2 years of the opening of the option market, the BSM model was overwhelmingly the dominant tool used on the exchange. So here you have a mainstream of new practice, big markets, etc. And what are they doing? They're using a scientifically developed model that was developed entirely in theory, but it happened to be a pretty good theory, and it fit what was needed for the job. Now, therefore, finance practice was certainly shaped by the science, no question in this period. But the data generated from trading on the options exchange, in turn, made it possible for the scientific testing of the option model and improving it, and improving all these types of models. The option model is not just about options, it's about using contracts in general, and I'll speak a little more about that before I and so what you have is that practice was shaped by science, but the science also was shaped by practice. And this interplay has been going on, as I said, for many decades, and it all looks like that's going to be a continuing process. For those of you that are in the field or in the interest in that, and I hope that this would sort of bring you into where financial engineering came from. Now, I should mention that, as I said, beyond just the options model, it turned out that the way the model was developed, it was immediately clear when you looked at it that you could use it for many other kinds of contracts, not just options, and for things that didn't look like they were options or contracts like that, but like risky corporate debt and so forth. But in fact, all came from the same genus, the same thing. So that allowed the development in practice of a universal tool of financial engineering, because it gave you the power to be able to solve problems of all kinds on a very customized basis, but do it on a sort of assembly line cost. And this led to general derivative pricing. So that's the history of how this got started and where it goes. And it's an enormous industry. What I'd like to do now, though, is to take you through a case study of applying financial engineering to a very serious real economic problem is what I think is a very fine example of how financial engineering can impact the real economy, Main Street, if you like, issues, by using financial technology, not physical technology. So the example I want to take you through now took place about 30 years ago at the time that East and West Germany reunified in the early 1990s. And the reunification, Germany made the decision that it wanted the what was East German economy to come up to the same level as the West German economy. That became a national objective. Well, to do that, that would mean that those located cities and operations located in what was East Germany would have to grow a great deal. And the case study I want to talk about is about a city that was in East Germany, Leipzig. And if Leipzig was going to grow, it needed more electricity. To get more electricity, it needed natural gas because it had to bring the gas in. That's how the electricity was generated in that space. So Leipzig needed to get a much improved supply, big increase in supply of natural gas in order to grow and meet this mandate. Now, this is a city that operated in East Germany. So for a generation, it had been essentially in a command and control economy, prices more or less fixed, no sophisticated analyses, stock markets or anything like that, all completely planned economy. And so, the city, the people managing the city, you call them the city managers, mayors, and so forth, were the same people that were there before when in East Germany because they understood their city and their people, they were from the city. We're not very sophisticated financially. Didn't understand a whole bunch of things. Nothing wrong with it. They just didn't. That's the background they come from, and it's important for the story for you to keep that in mind. So, the city and the CEO of the pipeline company, the ENG of Leipzig, were given essentially two choices of how they might get more gas. Choice one here on the left was get your gas from the west, bring it from the North Sea and so forth. You have to build a pipeline, of course, to bring it connected to the European grid, and bring it in and then buy it. And gas in the West was basically priced off the U.S. dollar. Okay, so that was one choice. But there was another choice they had, which came from a Russian consortium from the East, who said to Leipzig, no, come and run a bigger, longer pipeline, more expensive to build pipeline, but run a pipeline to connect to the Russian gas grid. And in return, we will give you 15 years of a fixed price contract in Deutschmark. It's Deutschmarks because this is pre-euro. So that was the currency of Germany. So you're sitting there as a manager, and if you do the choice one, you have a smaller pipeline plus $50 million plus whatever else. If you do choice two, you're going to have to spend a lot more for the pipeline, much longer pipeline. But in return, you get that prices will be constant for 15 years in Deutschmarks, in the currency for which Leipzig was using. So basically a fixed price for 15 years. Now, looking at the character of the people who are used to fixed pricing, the idea that they would buy their gas and have it fluctuate up and down, both because of the price of gas globally, but also because of currency fluctuation between Deutschmark and dollar, for example, they create a lot of fluctuation in gas prices. That fluctuation would translate to a lot of fluctuation in electricity, and it was just perceived by both the city managers and the CEO of the pipeline company. That was too much variation for people. They just couldn't deal with it. So they were seriously considering choice two, the Russian one. Now, at that time, there was a there were many, but there was one large international bank. In fact, I can say the name now. It was J.P. Morgan, a big international bank that had developed a division that I'll call the problem-solving division. It was a solutions businesses. Basically, its mandate was find clients, understand what their problem is, their challenge is, and solve it for them. You start with the client and the problem instead of starting with a product and convincing people to buy it. And they built this, and they were in solutions business. They were essentially in financial engineering. All right. When they heard about this, they looked at the two choices and they say, we think we can build something better. Third choice. And they did. So let me just tell you from the point of view of the city managers what they offered. They came to the city managers and they said, here's our proposal to you. Do the physical pipeline to the west. Get your gas from the west, okay, physically. And buy it at spot prices, whatever they are, okay? We, J.P. Morgan, will write you a contract that says anytime you pay more than X Deutschmarks per MCF, where X was the fixed price that the Russian consortium offered. Okay, so the Russians said fixed price at X Deutschmarks per MCF for 15 years. JP Morgan says anytime you pay more than X under our arrangement, we'll make up the difference. We'll pay you anything you pay over that. So you're never going to pay more than X Deutschmarks per MCF. But with this, if the spot price after the fact is lower than X Deutschmarks per MCF, you buy it at that price and you pay it. So if you just look at this for a moment, imagine you're the city manager. Here are your choices. You can do a fixed price for 15 years, no fluctuation from Russia, X Deutschmarks, or you could do the JP Morgan solution and you'll pay no more than X, and sometimes you'll pay less. Now, what I want you to see from this is that's a very easy decision to make. It doesn't involve doing financial analysis, present values, worrying about risk and management and all of that thing. It simply says you have a choice. You can get X or you can get no more than X and less under these conditions. You get the minimum. So that's a pretty simple, simple thing to understand to make a decision. And that, as I will point out in a minute, is a critical example of a well-designed financially engineered solution. Okay, I'm going to show you how they engineered, or at least describe some of it. Okay, but that's what they offered. Now, how did of course, J.P. Morgan was going to charge them for that service of saying, we'll always pay you if you pay more on that contract. And the price they quoted to Leipzig was, for 15 years, we'll do this cap, this looking at making sure you never pay more, but the price is 125 million. Okay? So they pay 125 million, but then they get the better contract. And the question is, where did that come from and what it is? Now, what I want to show you is a more detailed analysis or comparison of the two contracts, because I want you to see that there were a lot more going on here than just simply something that was a better contract in terms of the obvious terms. So the point I wanted to make is that a good solution may not be simple, but it has to be simple for the users. And as I pointed out to you, the solution they offer was extremely simple. No ifs, ands, and buts, and no, you take the risk and we tell you expected values and things will work out. But if they don't, it's your problem. Okay? Now, let's just look. This is the Russian solution. To build the pipeline to Russia, they would have to spend 300 million. That's Leipzig. For the JP Morgan financially engineered solution, they paid $50 million for the shorter pipeline to the west, plus $125 million. They pay a total of $175 million. So comparing the Russian contract with the financially engineered contract, Leipzig saves in capital costs $125 million. That was a lot of money then, particularly for this thing. Okay, it's a lot of money today, but it's a really lot of money then. So let's look at the operating costs again. If they have the Russian contract, they always pay X Deutschmarks per MCF for the 15 years. With JP Morgan, they pay the minimum of X or the spot price. So they save, whatever the spot price, they save by the difference between X and that spot price. Okay, so just on pure numbers, you see capital costs, they save 125 million. Operating costs, or at least the cost of the gas, they save money. So that's enough. But I want to take this little time with you to point out some of the other risks that this addressed. Risks that are not so easy to quantify, but are very important. So let's consider what I call local political risk. Imagine that they took the Russian deal and they're paying X Deutschmarks per MCF as they're contractually obliged. What happens in 2 or 3 years if the spot price of gas falls well below X, let's say half X? What will happen? Leipzig will be committed still to pay X. The rest of the world buying it will pay X over 2. What do you think is going to be the response of the citizens of Leipzig? They're going to say, why are we paying twice the price that everybody else is now paying? Well, of course, anyone understands that's what happens when you lock in a price. Okay, you hedge a price. The good news is you don't have any fluctuation in price. The bad news is that you may wish you had fluctuation in price if the price falls so you could buy it cheaper. So you have this very complex problem politically because there's no way you can explain why it's perfectly sensible or rational that they hedged it, etc. Explaining that to students of finance is not easy, as anyone who's taught them knows. To explain that in a 30-second side value to the general population is hopeless. So you're going to have a lot of local political. The Morgan solution eliminates that because you never pay more than the spot price. So that's gone. So basically, it eliminates local political risk. Now let's go to a second example. Yes, it's a 15-year contract with this Russian consortium, X Deutschmarks per MCF, but there's the risk with all contracts of performance risk. They may not deliver on what they promised. Okay? I mean, they have, let's say they did the Russian contract, they're standing there, it says X Deutschmarks per MCF. Russia at that time had several experiences of reneging on their contract term and a very low credit rating as a result. And indeed, 6 years later, they defaulted on their debt. Okay? So imagine if you lock in 15 years, you think you're covered with a fixed price, and your counterparty says, I'm not going to fulfill it. What a nightmare. You know? With the JP Morgan case, of course, you're relying on their promise that any time the spot price is above the X, they'll make up the difference. So that is a credit risk. But what was JP Morgan? JP Morgan was a global bank, one of the largest in the world, regulated by just every central bank, the Fed, the Bank of England, et cetera, AAA rating, okay, and with lots of capital. So when you look at contract performance, basically, this is as good as you get. It's better than many, many governments, and certainly a much better credit rating than Russia on its promise. So again, contract performance risk is eliminated. But we're not done. Okay? Now, sadly, given where we are today, this is very much a 2022 situation, again, which is geopolitical security risk. If Leipzig did the Russian deal, Russia would control the supply of the flow of gas to Leipzig. That means they could turn it off. And as we know, that's a big issue today and has been, and will likely be in the future. However, under the JPM solution, the gas all comes from the West, different sources, so forth. Basically, that's not going to happen. And so another risk limited, geopolitical security risk, one very much on our minds today, sadly. Finally, I want to talk about environmental risk. Had they done the Russian deal, a very long, much longer pipeline, that's why it was 300 million to build instead of 50, the one to the west, a much longer pipeline would have been built. And everybody agrees that pipelines are dirty for the environment. No one argues that that isn't the case. And this would be in a very much longer pipeline, dirty pipeline. So as a result of doing the JP Morgan solution, the physical aspect of the pipeline is the little one, the small one, much smaller, okay? Even though the economics to what they pay for the gas is been transferred, to protect on price and so forth, so they didn't have to take the price risk. So they got the physical gas from one place, with the pricing and everything from another. And JP Morgan in doing so, they eliminated, they created a greener solution, which again is a 2022 solution. So finance and financial engineering 30 years ago in solutions like these, in summary, was they were solving important economic problems here. This was a fundamental problem. This was solved, for the city to grow and develop. All right. And they were actually doing things that were both greener and were addressing risks that, as I say, are much more difficult to quantify, but made it much better. And Leipzig has been a beneficiary of that for all these decades. So I think this is a very nice, clear case to see how a well-done engineered problem is done. Before I move away from this and complete my remarks, I just wanted to say something about the nature of this contract, the way it was done. I've already said and pointed out to you, from the point of view of the customer in Leipzig, it was really simple and easy to make decisions. It was transparent. It did not require them to do risk assessments and take risk beyond whatever the other risk they had. Okay. It was simple to make a decision. But I can tell you, for JP Morgan to create that solution, okay, was incredibly a complex problem. They had all kinds of risks. They had currency risk, they had gas price risk, because they were putting what's called a cap on this. They were basically selling insurance or options on the price stock, having to pay more than a certain price. That meant that the volatility of the gas prices and currencies also was a risk to JP Morgan in making this promise. So they had many, many kinds of risks that they were facing. And the markets, the ones I was talking to you about, option markets, derivative markets, and so forth, in that period 30 years ago, were far fewer and far less well developed. There was no natural gas market to lay off the risk, etc. I won't go into the details. There were markets, both option markets and futures markets and swap markets, that could be used by JP Morgan to lay off in the world markets many of the risks that they were taking on to do this solution for Leipzig. Okay. And what they were able to do, anything they could lay off in world markets, reduce the risk to JP Morgan in providing their promise, reduce the cost, reduce the amount of capital they need. Therefore, they were able to provide a more competitive price and actually solve the problem by laying it off. But even with using all the markets, first of all, they had to make all kinds of substitutes. They had to use things like heating oil to hedge gas prices and so forth. So they had lots of approximations and what's called basis risks that they couldn't get rid of in the markets. So JP Morgan had to take it, and that's what their capital did. They used very sophisticated financial models, ones from financial science, in their financial engineering solution. So the juxtaposition of simplicity for the client means generally much more complexity, much more need for technology, data, and capital, and all other things for the producer. But I would say to you, if you just think about it, that's the way it should be. If there's complexity that is needed, that you can't get rid of, that you need in order to get a solution, that complexity belongs with the professionals. It belongs with the entities that do this for a living, not with the customers. And this is a universal belief I have for what's a good design for a financial product. But sadly, many times products are not designed that way. I hope they will more and more be, but they're not. And this is one that exemplifies that. So it was not a simple thing for JP Morgan to execute. And so financial engineering couldn't have been done without the models from finance science and technology and the markets that were created. And so that's my story on financial engineering and so forth. Now, I want to close my remarks by pointing out a couple of things. I mentioned about the options market and how it got started back in 1973. Today, half a century later, we'll have 50th anniversary next year. The volume here, you may not be able to see on the screens. The volumes, of course, were tiny, but this is just for the US listed options market that in 2021, 10 billion contracts, not units or dollars, contracts were traded in options in that period. And we're talking about covering trillions of dollars and billions of dollars. Options are essential and ubiquitous in the financial system, not in any one country, but around the world. The idea, they are mainstream, and this is the power of these contracts in these derivative markets to allow very efficient transfer of risk and structuring of risk that allow engineering and the process of production of solutions, laying off the risk in world markets rather than forcing it into a single entity, or worse, sending the risk to the customers who really aren't equipped to handle it in any effective way. But I mentioned that options were only the beginning in that sense. We now have derivative markets. I mentioned the swap markets. There's swap markets in currencies and gold and just about everything. And I just want to show you the magnitude. These were just not listed ones. These are over-the-counter ones done, through institutions and so forth. Derivative, what I call notional amount. If you're not familiar with that means, this is just the amount of underlying asset risk or amounts covered. This is, so many billions of dollars of loan interest, swap between fixed and floating, or so many barrels of oil or something of this sort. The total notional amount that's being covered by these contracts, if you look at the scaling here, this past year was over 650 trillion. That's $1 trillion. You see it was over 700 earlier, okay? To scale that for you, this red line is the net world GDP. It's about 100 trillion. So you can see this is an enormous market in the term of amount of risk that's being, or assets, if you like, or risks that are being transferred or moved around and held, globally. So the derivatives market, the options market, these tools, these markets that are used are fundamental. They're going to be there. Discussions otherwise are just silly in my view. And they are playing a very important role. So looking to the future, okay, we certainly have many challenges out there, individually within countries, but more globally. And of course, the big one that we are all talking about is climate change, which affects everybody in the world. And I'm hopeful, even cautiously a bit optimistic, that we are going to be able to address the climate problem. We have to. Okay. And I don't know what the solutions will be, but I'm very confident that whatever those solutions are, they're going to be, finance is going to play an important, essential role in implementing those solutions, very much like I showed you here in this particular example involving Germany in the early 1990s. Okay, that finance will always be there because the transfer of risk efficiently and moving things around, those who best can hold the risk holding it, has a profound effect on growth and development and real economics. And so that's the excitement I feel about this field. I've been in it for 50 years, practicing both writing theories and science, but also implementing. And, you know, I think it's a wonderful field to be in because there are always problems. And if you're in the solutions business, you'll always have work. Well, I thank you very much for your time. I hope you see the importance here of finance science, implementation of it, and underlying all of this is data. You can't do the science without the data, and you can't solve the problems of the engineering without good data. And so data, technology, and finance science, the three are drivers of how we will continue to solve problems in the future. And let me just even say one of the ways we may, and this is speculative, but not wild, is it looks like maybe, and I have to use notice the maybe, it looks like cold fusion. We may be making some progress on making that a reality. That's for another evening's discussion. But cold fusion, if it can be done, and I think it can, will transform energy. And I say this to you about the big things because I want to, I hope, excite you, or at least of how big these challenges are and how finance, which is entirely intangibles, there were no physical pipelines. JP Morgan did nothing with them. Those markets are just, zeros and ones and trading and so forth. But they play an essential role in all of these innovations and solutions we have to economic development and growth and keeping this planet as the kind of place where we can actually survive and get thrive. So thank you very much, and I'll say good night to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robert.